Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. In this episode, we're diving into the ethics of drill music, a genre that's been celebrated for its creativity and authenticity, but also heavily criticised for its alleged links to violence. Drill is often portrayed as uniquely dangerous, and some have called for it to be censored. Philosopher and Beacon Junior Research Fellow at University College Oxford, Tareeq Jalloh, joins me to get underneath the discourse around drill. We discuss what the evidence shows about drill's supposed role as a cause of violence, as well as the wider social and racial dimensions of the controversy. Together, we'll ask what's really at stake when society debates the ethics of drill. So I'm here with Tareeq Jalloh. So Tareeq, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
No worries. So we're going to talk about drill today and some of the ethical issues connected with drill, and I suppose specifically the ways drill has been connected with violence and, you know, the way people might have kind of sought to censor drill using the fact or the suggestion that it's been connected with violence as a justification or maybe a pretext for censoring it. So I wondered if you could start, for the benefit of our listeners who might not know what drill is, by just telling us a bit about what drill is and how it's different from other forms of rap or hip hop.
Yeah, sure. So drill music is one of many subgenres of hip hop. It originated in the early 2010s in Chicago's South Side area. And inspired by Chicago drill, various countries have developed their own distinctive versions. So a popular version is UK drill, which will be our focus today. So UK drill emerged from the council estates of South London, coming to prominence in the mid to late 2010s. So while UK drill shares many similarities with Chicago drill, it also draws inspiration from earlier British genres such as grime, garage, and drum and bass. And grime is a style of kind of UK hip hop or dance music, some say, originating in the council estates of East London, known for its dark and energetic sound. So these influences have added a distinctiveness to UK drill. So drill's distinctiveness from other subgenres of rap can be assessed along at least three lines: production, flow, and lyrics. Most important for our purposes today is the distinctiveness of its lyrics. So like Chicago drill, the lyrics of UK drill are often a violent and cold engagement with life in deprived areas. And this involves taunting rivals in vividly shocking terms, describing the harm that awaits them, and keeping a tally of scoreboards as a sign of collective's transgressive capital, as Lambros Fatsis puts it in his 2019 article, Policing the Beats.
Right, okay. I guess, like, just to put it in very simple terms, it's quite an aggressive sort of hard-sounding hip-hop, right? Would that be fair to say?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. In what ways has drill been connected to violence then?
Yeah, so as for some context, the critique that, rap is problematically connected to violence goes as far back as the 1980s. So hip-hop artists such as Public Enemy, who sought to call upon blacks to fight against racism by any means necessary, were considered politically radical advocates of violence. So the police watched Public Enemy and their raps contributed to the creation of a study of rap music and the possible effects on national security. So the critique that rap is connected to violence in problematic ways is still prevalent today. So Andrew Tate, of all people, appeared on Piers Morgan's show Uncensored, arguing that he is not the worst influence on the youth, since you have drill artists singing about stabbing people to death in the middle of a knife crime epidemic. A day after the May 24, 2022 Uvalde mass shooting, US Rep Ronnie Jackson blamed the violence on violent rap music and video games. So he claimed that kids are exposed to all kinds of horrible stuff nowadays, and I think about the horrible stuff they hear when they listen to rap music, the video games they watch with all this horrible violence. So one of the latest subgenres to be of rap to be targeted by the critique that rap is connected to violence in problematic ways is drill rap music. So the critique that rap's connected to violence in problematic ways has not only led to the censorship of many drill rappers, but in some cases it's also led to their lyrics and videos being used in criminal as evidence in criminal courts. So, for instance, in the UK, there has been a surge in the number of criminal trials using rap/drill lyrics as and videos as evidence. So, in my research, I disentangled the various ways drill music has been connected to violence. I think this is valuable because there's often a conflation occurring that inhibits our ability to see whether drill really does have a problematic connection to violence. So the first way, which is the way that we're going to look at today, the first claim I investigate is what I call the causal claim, which is the critique that drill causes violence. This critique is being used to justify restrictions and the censorship of drill artists as the police remove drill videos from social media and streaming platforms and impose criminal behavior orders on drillers based on the view that their music is causing retaliatory gang violence when drillers taunt rivals. Another way that these censorious measures are being justified is based on what I call the incitement claim, which is the view that drill music incites violence. And this differs from the causal claim because inciting violence doesn't require that violence has occurred in the same way that causing violence does. I think in order to investigate the causal claim, we need some empirical evidence to show that it's true. Whereas with incitement, whilst empirical evidence might come in handy, we need to pay attention to the speech acts in drill and whether drillers are performing elocutionary acts of incitement. I think this depends on the satisfaction of certain felicity conditions. Another separated but related way that it's said to be problematically connected to violence is that it evidences violence, what I call the evidencing claim. So this claim is being used to justify the use of drill as evidence in criminal courts, such as bad character evidence and joint enterprise evidence. And again, I think this differs from the causal claim. And the final way has been criticized for its connection to serious violence is that it glorifies violence, what I call the glorification claim. And this doesn't glorification of violence doesn't necessarily result in violence. It doesn't entail that violence being glorified as evidence of the rapper's crimes. So it's different to the previous claims. But it's often thought of as bad in the context of the perpetuation of negative stereotypes or other harms are related to physical violence, or to black people in particular. So whilst the evidence in causal and incitement claim have been used to criminalize rap music, the glorification claim has been used as a form of moral condemnation.
Right, yeah.
Those are four kind of bases of critique that I think underpin rap music's criminalization and condemnation. And yeah, I guess we're looking at the causal claim today.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So you kind of introduced the various ways in which drill rap music has been connected to violence, and as you say, there's lots of different ways of understanding that. And I suppose I think back to sort of moral panics that have been that have happened around all sorts of forms of music, including various kind of subgenres of rap and hip hop in the past. And the suggestion that kind of music glorifies violence is something that's often brought out, but that's very different from the idea that it causes violence, right? And I suppose one way in which it's different is if it's true that it glorifies violence, and certainly depending on how you understand glorifies violence, thinking about gangster rap from the 90s or whatever, it certainly does seem to, in some sense glorify violence, but that might be a reason to morally condemn it, but it's hard to see how that in itself is a reason to censor it or ban it, right? Whereas if it can actually be implicated in causing violence, then at least it's a bit easier to see how those kinds of programs might get off the ground. So we're going to look at this idea that it doesn't just glorify violence, it doesn't even just incite violence, but it actually causes violence. So how should we understand the word cause in this context then?
Yeah, so I think we can look to other forms of media. So a popular media form that is often criticized for its alleged connection to violent harm is pornography. So pornography has been criticized on many fronts, and the critique that pornography causes harm, violent and otherwise, is known as the harm hypothesis by many. And there's an extensive literature on the proposed harms of pornography, and within this literature we find frameworks that make sense of what cause and harm mean. So one especially influential framework developed to address this issue is offered by Anne Eaton. So Eaton critiques the conception of cause and harm typically employed in pornography debates. And Eaton theorizes causation in a non-deterministic way. So she draws on from methods used in epidemiology, which seen as our current best science of causes, to present a probabilistic account of causation. And the process by which pornography may shape attitudes and may lead to behavior can be specified by drawing an analogy with smoking. So smoking does not cause cancer in a deterministic way. Many smokers do not develop lung cancer. Smoking is neither necessary nor sufficient to develop lung cancer. Still, medical experts and the general public accept as true the claim that smoking causes cancer, since it increases the likelihood of developing cancer. So this is just one thing Eaton suggests would constitute a sensible harm hypothesis about pornography. And using her other recommendations, I think a sensible rendition of the causal claim would do the following things. The causal claim about rap would do the following things. So first, and like Eaton, it would take on a probabilistic notion of cause. Second, it would emphasize that violent effects of rap are a cumulative effect of several factors in a complex causal mechanism. Three, proponents of the causal claim would specify that the type of rap they're worried about, in other words, I put the police are worried about drill rap that includes antagonizing messages towards rivals. Four, if there's a causal connection, it will be implicated in complex feedback loops. Five, the violent harms critics like the police are worried about will be made clear. For instance, they seem to be worried about retaliatory gang violence. And six, a sensible rendition of the causal claim is cautious and not necessarily in favor of state intervention, since it is sensitive to the many other purported harms when coming up with preventative measures. So, yeah.
Good. Okay. So, first of all, just to unpack that idea of probabilistic versus deterministic causation. So, what we're talking about is, so I think the comparison with smoking causing cancer is really helpful to illustrate this, right? So, fairly uncontroversial that smoking causes cancer, but it's not the case that everybody who smokes gets cancer, right? So it's not going to be true that smoking inevitably and deterministically leads to cancer, right? So it's going to be more probabilistic. Smoking is going to hugely increase your risk of getting cancer, but it's not going to determine that you definitely will get cancer. And so we're understanding causation in a similar kind of way here. But as you say, like, correlation isn't going to be enough, right? So correlation doesn't imply causation. And it could be, for example, that people who listen to drill are more likely to be involved in violence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the listening to drill that's causing them to be involved in violence. So I think you've kind of noted this, but I think it's worth drawing this out. We're not necessarily, the claim here that people who are opposed to drill are making is not necessarily something like people listen to drill and it riles them up and they go out and they perpetrate violence. It's more, or that anybody who listens to drill is kind of more likely to cause violence as a result. It's more that drill is implicated in these kind of fights and arguments between rival gang members and things like this, right? And that drill might be one way in which kind of aggressive messages are being sort of sent from one person to another, and that people might then be prompted to retaliate as a result of that. Is that right, or is it a bit of both, actually?
I think that's right. I also think there's a sense in which it's a bit of both. So the police are saying that antagonistic messages in drill music are causing a violent retaliatory response in their rivals, and yeah, I do think that there's a sense in which it's a bit of both. But yeah, I don't think the police they might be, but I guess what I'm concerned with is how the police are really focusing on offline retaliatory violence, so gang violence, as opposed to drill music causing violence in, general audiences, like, save the kids kind of.
Yeah. Because that's the kind of thing we would have heard back in the 80s and 90s, right? And maybe they're a bit kind of aware that doesn't fly really anymore, because nobody's really been able to evidence that works, right? So maybe the focus on the kind of inter-gang retaliatory violence is because they think that there's more chance of convincing people that that's a real causal connection. Okay, so, well, what do you think then? Is there actually evidence that drill causes violence in any of those ways?
Yeah, so staying on Eaton's framework, I think there are important recommendations in Eaton's framework which can illuminate how anti-rap critics might verify or provide evidence for the sensible rendition of the harm hypothesis or the causal claim for our purposes. So Eaton suggests anti-pornography feminists would do well to verify the harm hypothesis by employing epidemiological methods. And epidemiologists use clinical trials, ecological studies, case control, and cohort studies to determine whether there is a strong positive association between, for instance, smoking and cancer. For example, a case control study compares the smoking histories of two groups, one with lung cancer and one without lung cancer, and cohort studies compares smokers with non-smokers, determining the rate of lung cancer in each group. To my knowledge, no studies looking to establish the causal claim about rap have employed clinical trials, ecological studies, or case control / cohort studies. But even, and I think you alluded to this earlier, even if we suppose through these studies that a meaningful correlation between drill and violence can be demonstrated, we still need to do more to establish a causal relation. And epidemiologists standardly appeal to 6 criteria to determine whether a correlation is causal with respect to a disease. These puts it: temporality, strength replication, quantum dose relationship, plausibility, consideration of alternative explanations, and cessation data. And so what do these kind of 6 criteria look like regarding the causal claim about rap? So with regards to temporality, consuming rap must precede the violent effects as the first condition of the sensible rendition of the causal claim makes clear. This would mean that a video taunting another gang would have been released before the alleged offline retaliatory response. The second, strength replication. Studies investigating the correlation between rap music and violent attitudes, behaviors in gang-associated youth must provide strong correlations that replicate. Third, quantum dose relationship, so increasing the duration, total exposure, intensity, and level of taunts, threats, and antagonisms increase the likelihood of violent attitudes and behaviors in gang-associated youth. Plausibility, should a correlation between violent rap music and violent effects be found, this should be explainable by our best theories and hypotheses. 5, consideration of alternative explanations. So our investigators must take alternative causes of violence into account. So, for instance, have investigators looked at causes other than taunts and drill rap as an explanation for violent attitudes and behaviors, I don't know, such as a location being advertised on social media, as Stuart Swart kind of demonstrates my lead to violence. 6 is cessation data. If rap music is a causal factor of violent effects, the risk of violent effects should decrease with the decrease in consumption of rap. So if rap is a causal factor of offline retaliatory violence, the risk of offline retaliatory violence should decrease with the decrease in gang-associated youth's consumption of rap. So just say the evidence claim to support the causal claim about rap, I think, has yet to meet the criteria needed to show any strong correlation or / causal relationship between drill music and retaliatory gang violence. Proponents of the causal claim, I think, can appeal to at least 2 sets of literature as evidence. So one set of studies could look at how rap produces copycat violence by looking at the general effects of rap music on general audiences. But as we talked about earlier, this is quite problematic and not exactly the kind of violence that police seem to be worried about, and is riddled with all sorts of problems, as we might go into later. And the second set of studies could look at how adherence to the code of the street causes retaliatory gang violence in gang-associated youth.
Yeah, okay. I can see how that works. I was wondering though, because if we're using smoking causing cancer as a comparison, that's really well established now, but it took a long time to establish that causal claim, right? And it's at least plausible, right, that rap tracks and videos that contain threats and taunts referencing violence would act as one vector in antagonisms that lead to actual violence. So again, thinking back to like gangster rap in the 90s, right? Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls were actually killed, right, in gang violence in which the rap records that they were making played some part, right? So I just wondered, and therefore that it suggests at least that kind of that the role played by music in these kind of wider conflicts might be significant. So I was just wondering, is the evidentiary standard that you're asking for here possibly a bit too high to actually establish in a kind of scientific way that there's this causation?
Yeah. Just say I agree that in the future there might be conclusive evidence to show the connection between drill / rap and offline retaliatory violence. However, it seems condemnable that the police and the state make the causal claim with such intensity and base censorious measures on the causal claim due to prospects of there being future evidence.
So I was just wondering, do you think there might be a chance that the evidentiary standard that you're invoking there, trying to kind of prove causally and scientifically that drill causes violence, might be too high?
There might be a future in which we find conclusive evidence to show the connection between drill and offline retaliatory violence. However, it seems condemnable that the police and state make the causal claim with such intensity and then base censorious measures on it due to the prospect of there being future evidence establishing a conclusive causal relation. I also think it's plausible that rap tracks containing taunts might contribute to gang violence. But I think given what's at stake, we need something more conclusive than plausibility. I'm open to the evidentiary burden being too high, but the issue is that those making the causal claim haven't provided a lower evidentiary burden. They just assume this is true. Further, when we think about what's at stake, the over-policing of an already over-policed demographic, I think the evidentiary burden must match the potential harm that these censorious measures bring.
Yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. All right. So what do we know from empirical studies about how people listen to hip-hop and how listeners interpret hip-hop records?
The most rigorous analysis of the literature on rap music's alleged violent effects was conducted by Charis Kubrin and Ronald Weitzer in 2010. So they found that many of the studies on rap's effects are non-empirical, so many authors theorize about rap's effects on one's identity, political inclinations, attitudes and behaviors based on mere anecdotal evidence and selective quotations. They also, Kubrin Weitzer further identify some writings on rap as quasi-empirical, so these cases differ from mere anecdote insofar as there is some data to support the points of the authors, but the methodological shortcomings of studies limit the ability to draw conclusions from them. They identify some studies that use empirical data to back up their conclusions. However, these studies are hard to come by and often conclude that the relationship between rap and violent behaviors and attitudes is complex rather than concluding that listening to rap promotes violence. So in one study by Harry and Connor, it revealed that youths who listened to rap had more progressive values than the values represented in rap discourse to which they're exposed. They also found that some youths had cogent critiques of negative characterizations of men and women in rap, particularly representations of men as gangsters, women as hoes. Their study kind of challenges the simple connections that the dominant public discourse and media so often draw between rap music and pervasive negative influences on black youth. And I think this aligns with recent studies which have found that violent themes in music can give fans a range of positive psychological functions.
Right, okay. One of the most interesting bits of the paper that you wrote about this that I've read, I thought, was where you were kind of summarising some of this empirical work into how gang members actually communicate with each other and how drill fits into that wider picture. So what do we know about how gang members communicate with each other, including through social media, and how drill fits into that?
So yeah, one of the most in-depth analyses of how gang-associated youth use social media comes from the ethnographic work of Forrest Stewart. So Stewart's work as a director of an after-school youth violence prevention program kind of allowed him to gain access to gang members or gang-associated youth and their families. He recruited 60 young men, 29 of them being members of Corner Boys Entertainment or CBE, and 31 others coming from allied gang factions. So Stewart enlisted participants to review each day's social media activity with him, including reviewing their posts and uploads and debrief sessions which focused attention on providing key data, prompts and discussions for materials, as well as asking participants about the origins, aims, meanings and consequences of particular online antagonisms. And this meant Stewart could kind of follow feuds as they developed in real time from online to offline spaces if they did. He found that gang-associated individuals engage in online antagonisms as part of an innovative and intentional effort to build violent reputations without the necessity of behaving violently offline. So we can understand drill music as fitting into this picture where taunts in drill are aimed at undermining a rival's violent persona whilst underlining a taunter's own violent persona. And unlike the parallelism thesis, which critics use to provide a basis for the causal claim, since it argues that online activity mirrors offline activity, in other words, the same gang violence mechanisms on the urban street unfold online, and predicting that social media necessarily increases both intensity and frequency of offline or retaliatory violence. Scholars like Stewart argue that assuming a sort of parallelism or direct positive or causal relationship between social media use and physical retaliation overlooks important opportunities for youth to de-escalate or avoid offline gang violence. Moreover, arguing that online antagonisms mirror offline interactions neglects how offline conflicts are transformed by social media. So while gangs indeed challenge rivals online, these challenges are characterized by distinct rules, conventions, consequences that afford new and different kinds of outcomes while constructing previous ones. Crucially, I think insults uttered online in drill music videos carry different meanings and demand different responses than if they were merely uttered in the street.
Right, yeah. That sounds really interesting work. So it was Stewart, is that right?
So I guess it's Forrest Stewart.
Forrest Stewart.
Yeah, who's a sociologist at Stanford.
Right, okay. Maybe we can put a link to that work in the show notes so people can go and take a look at that themselves. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. I suppose that's all to say, firstly, you don't think, and you've argued quite persuasively, that people who oppose drill music or want to censor it have not met the explanatory burden, is that the way you put it, or that they haven't established this causal connection that they need to? But you also argue that proponents of censorship must meet a justificatory burden. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So far we've been talking about the evidential burden. I argued that it's far from being met. The justificatory burden is the burden I think critics like the police must meet to justify their approach of censoring drill music and restricting drill artists' movement and freedoms, amongst other stuff.
Yeah. Okay, good. And can they meet that burden? Can they meet that justificatory burden?
Yeah, so I argue that the police intervention, so censoring drill, is not justified since other interventions are best suited to prevent violence. I think the first reason why censorship intervention is not justified is that public health approaches are shown by evidence to be more effective. So many have advocated for public health approach to serious violence, including gang violence and knife crime. And the public health approach suggests policymakers should search for a cure by using scientific evidence to identify what causes violence and developing/testing interventions. And this approach is beneficial insofar as it shifts emphasis away from police enforcement-led interventions, which often worsen the problems, as Williams and Squares argue in their 2021 book. For instance, in the specific case of censoring and restricting drillers, artists are often barred from various financial, emotional, and social benefits their music brings to them. It is thus counterproductive from a crime reduction perspective. A public health approach promises a science-based or epidemiological understanding of violence, whilst establishing more evidence-based, progressive, and sustainable solutions, and is thus wholly consistent with the sensible rendition of the causal claim that I propose. And the UK have already claimed great success for such an approach to reducing gang violence in Glasgow and Strathclyde, which had one of the highest rates of knife crime in the world before a public health approach was taken. For instance, Operation Reclaim, which focused on reopening sports and recreational areas to provide safe and sustainable educational, recreational and diversionary activities, combined with Operation Phoenix, which brought together teenagers to participate in sports and recreation activities and foster relationships with the police, have been highly successful interventions. Over the course of these operations, gang violence was recorded as having diminished between 40 and 70%. The second reason why I think censorship-oriented approaches are unjustified is that violence prevention strategies must be informed by those affected by violence, by what those affected by that violence see as good strategies, i.e. they must be community informed. And being community informed is important in selecting intervention because it brings about factors like consent, and it also appears epistemically superior since it factors in what communities think will work best for them. So even if an evidence-based approach shows us that drill music is a causal contributor to serious violence, we might still question whether censorship is justified. And this is important. This is an important constraint on interventions. Because an important constraint on interventions is that they must be consistent with what those within the community see as causing violence, and should uplift the community by taking a community building over police-led interventionist approaches.
Yeah, so I suppose what somebody might say in response to the point that you've made, that public health approaches are likely to be more effective and have been proven to be more effective in other areas, somebody might say, okay, but maybe that is the most effective approach, but censorship might still help, right? So it might still be a somewhat effective approach. And even if most of people's focus and priority should be on public health approaches, then censorship approaches might still be justified to some extent as like one part of the kind of toolkit that we have to try to improve matters. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I see that already. So I guess whether censorship is effective requires us to first establish that drill is a cause and should be therefore censored, which, as I've argued, hasn't been done. But to answer kind of the worry more specifically, I'll repeat something response I got from reviewer. So supposing drill causes violence, nothing sufficient to show that censorship is justified. For censorship to be justified, it requires more than showing it could alleviate a problem. It typically requires showing that the problem cannot be otherwise addressed. So the public health approach is less speech restrictive means of addressing the alleged problem. So censorship advocates must first show that such an approach is unpromising. So such a public health approach is unpromising. And if they cannot do so, then I think policies of censorship cannot be justified.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. And the final point that you make is that, not only have opponents of drill or proponents of censorship not met their evidentiary and justificatory burdens, right, to justify censorship and so on, but kind of further than that, they should be careful about the kinds of things that they're saying because they have what you describe as a racist public meaning. So, yeah, could you say what you mean by that?
That's just to say, this is often some folks are either really convinced by this or really just find this to be maybe quite weak. But so the public meaning is the meaning that others can justifiably attribute to our acts given the context in which we perform them, as Archer and Matheson argue in their 2019 or claim in their 2019 paper. For instance, Archer and Matheson give the following example. Say a man was to interrupt a woman in an important business meeting. In a business culture that is patriarchal, it seems reasonable to understand this interruption as expressing sexism, denigration of women, regardless of what we think the attitudes or intentions of the person are. So importantly, the interruption can have a sexist public meaning, even if the interrupter does not intend for his expression to express sexist values or the interrupter holds sexist attitudes.
Right, so that's interesting. Sorry to interrupt. So that interruption could have that public meaning not only regardless of whether the person doing the interrupting intends for it to be sexist or kind of consciously thinks of men being superior to women or whatever those attitudes are. But even if they don't hold those attitudes at all, right? So even if that act of interruption has nothing to do with any kind of belief or attitude that they have about men and women, it could still hold the public meaning of sexism.
Yeah. And so in philosophy, there's rich literature highlighting the importance of social / public meaning in a range of context. And I use the term interchangeably, so social public meaning. For example, Charles Mills, in assessing arguments in favor of black men's duty to marry black women, concludes that even if a black man's marriage to a white woman is A, not motivated by racism, and B, they're aware that it's not motivated by racism, there's always the fact that regardless of his motivations, black people perceive him as marrying out of racial self-hatred and reinforcing white supremacy. In other words, he writes that such interracial unions with white women might send the message that black women just ain't good enough. And here it seems that Mills acknowledges that despite such union not being motivated or caused by racist beliefs, attitudes, or intentions about white women's beauty, there still might be a racist public meaning that is communicated by such a union. Similarly, Robin Zeng argues that when we focus on the effects of racial fetish in a racially stratified world, rather than whether racial fetish is caused by negative racial stereotypes, racial fetishes can be objectionable. So Zeng asserts that publicly expressing racial fetishes such as yellow fever, a preference for Asian women, can have a racist public meaning, even if not caused by racist attitudes. And she writes that racial fetishes in a racially stratified society express racially stereotypical social meanings, even if not caused by them, and even if individuals with the preference do not endorse them. And again, Zeng and Robin Zeng and Niles Hens Stairs also argue that whilst fictively deploying unethical attitudes like blackface, are not objectionable in and of themselves or in and of itself. They become objectionable in virtue of their content and what is done with it, given the world we live in has a racist history.
Yeah, it's really interesting area, and we don't need to get into it in too much depth, I guess, for the kind of role that it plays in your overall argument. But I suppose somebody might object to that kind of picture of public meaning on the grounds that it's kind of making people responsible for the way other people interpret what they say and do, rather than for actually what they say and do. But I suppose the point that you would make is you can't kind of act and speak in a way that's somehow isolated from the kind of broader attitudes that exist within society, right? And you need to think not just about your own kind of attitudes and beliefs and so on, but how those are going to be received by other people and how they might be interpreted by other people.
Yeah. So speech act theorists, for instance, especially feminist speech act theorists have argued for the importance of the role of uptake in certain utterances, and sometimes it misfires. The intention of a speaker is not, it doesn't receive the correct uptake, so there's misfire there. But uptake is still something important, and how people respond is still quite important. Yeah,
I suppose it's just kind of cautioning people to think about the effect of their speech, independently of kind of what intention might lie behind it, right? It's as simple as that, and that in itself isn't too controversial, I guess.
So just to say very briefly, I don't think a public meeting should trump everything all the time.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's something to consider. It's just in this case the other things to consider, such as whether advancing the causal claim is based in evidence, or whether there's the correct justification for censoring drillers. These kind of considerations against or these things that we need to consider along with the racist public meaning. I just feel that the racist public meaning adds an additional reason just not to make that claim, again, because of what we mentioned before.
That makes absolute sense. Yeah. So I suppose, if it was the case that they'd really clearly established the causal connection that they were claiming, and that it was really watertight, their kind of justification for censorship and so on, then you might say, well, the racist public meaning, it's a factor, but these other things outweigh it, right? But given that they haven't done any of that stuff, then the racist public meaning gives us an additional reason to think maybe don't be pursuing those kind of projects. Yeah. Good. Okay. All right. Well, I guess that's probably about all we've got time for. So thanks very much. That's really interesting. I was wondering, there's loads of kind of research and stuff that you cited there. It would be great if we could put some links to that in the show notes. But I was wondering if we could also put some links to some drill. So I must admit, I don't listen to drill very much. I think I've heard the odd track, but if there's an introductory compilation or something that we could put a link to that people can get a sense of what we're actually talking about here, that might be good too.
Sure. Yeah, I'd enjoy creating a playlist. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah, cool.
Good stuff. All right. Well, thanks very much, Tareeq Jalloh, for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.